everyone. Welcome back. I'm Jack Llewellyn, and this is Cartels, Conspiracies, and Camarena. So today we are on video number 3 of a 3-part series talking about the abduction of DEA Special Agent Enrique Kiki Camarena from outside the American consulate in Guadalajara on February 7, 1985. If you remember, in video number 1, what we did is we looked at the known facts surrounding the kidnapping and the events of that day, and we created a timeline based on those known facts. Facts coming from witness statements, contemporaneous documents, contemporaneous investigations. So we created a timeline of that day, both before and after Agent Camarena's abduction. In video number 2, we looked at the statements made by some alleged witnesses, and we found that without exception, they don't fit into the timeline of the known facts. They just don't fit. Today, we're going to answer, or we're going to look at some outstanding questions and issues with respect to the abduction itself, and we're going to draw a couple of potential conclusions. So let's look at some of the outstanding issues, questions, uncertainties surrounding Agent Camarena's abduction and the statements about that abduction. Okay. So number 1, if you remember, we talked about the fact that there was a lot of activity going on that day, right? Remember that prior to, about an hour before the kidnapping, Agents Kirkendall and Bachelier walked from the American consulate to the Camelot. About a half hour later, Agent Camarena by himself walked from the consulate to the Camelot. A little while later, Agents Kirkendall and Camarena went back to the consulate, and a few minutes later, so did Agent Bachelier. None of the witness statements, the alleged witnesses, mention any of this activity. And certainly none of them say, hey, we were sitting there waiting for Agent Camarena, and he walked by with Agent Kirkendall. Or he walked by himself going to the Camelot. None of that comes up. The other thing that's not explained is, think about this. You had 3 experienced, highly trained, aware agents. Keep in mind, tensions were high at that time. People knew that there was activity going on. They were on some kind of an alert, or at least heightened awareness, if you will. They go back and forth. Nobody notices anything out of the ordinary. Does that really make sense to you? Does that fit? All right, so that's number 1. Number 2, we mentioned this a little bit earlier in one of the other episodes, but we have a disappearing consulate employee. Remember, Rene Lopez Romero in his DEA-6 report in April of 1992, and then again on the stand at trial in December 1992, that's in Zuno 2, says Agent Camarena was identified by a blonde consulate employee. But now, in the last narc, it's not a blonde consulate employee, it's Rene Verdugo. And it wasn't Rene Verdugo. And it wasn't a blonde consulate employee. And as an aside, as I've mentioned before, the prosecution never identifies this person, doesn't produce them, doesn't present a document that could show that, this person was an employee, could be identified by Lopez Romero. Nothing. All you have is him saying it was a blonde employee, and it wasn't. All right. The DEA knows who the person was. It wasn't a blonde consulate employee, and it wasn't Rene Verdugo. But in any event, isn't it fascinating that the government doesn't produce anyone, and then Rene Lopez Romero completely changes the story. Truth of the matter is, he was lying both times. Or he certainly wasn't factual, both when he testified against Ruben Zuno Arce in Zuno 2 and when he talked to the DEA in April of 1992. All right. Number 3, things that just don't make sense. We know now that when Agent Kirkendall and others went to the consulate and went to Agent Camarena's truck the next day, so February 8th, after they figured out that he was missing, Agent Camarena's truck was unlocked and his radio was in the front seat. Now, everyone you talk to who was a DEA agent at the time, who worked with Agent Camarena, who rode in the car or the truck with Agent Camarena, was in any way involved, says you always locked your car. Always locked your truck. Camarena always did. Everybody did. They all did. But none of the witness statements, and we're going to talk about this in a little bit more detail in a second, none of the witness statements mention Camarena's truck at all. How can that possibly be? Here's what's interesting too. Where is a mention of the truck? In Hector Borges' book. What came before Hector Borges' book? Agent Kirkendall's book, where he says, I went to the truck the next morning and it was unlocked. And by the way, there's contemporaneous documentation to support that. So, of course, Borges' book could repeat that part of the story. But then if he does, it betrays what his own witnesses said. So it doesn't make sense. Again, something just doesn't quite add up. Okay, here's another one that doesn't quite add up. The abduction vehicle was a Volkswagen Atlantic, a small car, a very small car. Listen to this. Rene Lopez Romero says, both at trial and his DA-6, there were 4 people in the car before Agent Camarena. 4 people. He actually says that you got the blonde consulate employee who points out Camarena, who sits in the driver's seat of the car while the others go out and pick up Camarena and bring him back to the car. I'm sure that's standard operating procedure for kidnappings. Leave the guy, the one who's just there to identify, leave him in the car by himself with the car running in the front seat. Be that as it may. So the story Lopez Romero says is 4 people in the car. They cram Agent Camarena into the back seat, and then they drive to Lope de Vega. Okay, maybe. What does Agent Borges say? He says the lead car had 3 DFS agents. It had Samuel Ramirez Razo, El Sammy, and the consulate employee before Camarena was picked up. So that would mean you had 6 people in the car going from the consulate to Lope de Vega, and there ain't no way. Okay, not going to happen, didn't happen that way. Again, the witnesses put forth by the government at trial, by Amazon Prime in The Last Narc, by Hector Borges in The Last Narc in his book, don't provide facts that add up, that don't make sense. Okay, this is a small one. But I find it interesting. Was Camarena's head covered on the drive from the consulate to Lope de Vega? Rene Lopez Romero says, nope, it wasn't. In fact, he says that he was blindfolded with some gauze once they got to Lope de Vega. Espino Verdeen says that his head was covered. And Bareas says, and I quote, "They threw a jacket over Kiki's head and sped off." Now, again, I ask you, how can Agent Bareas say something in his book that contradicts what Lopez Romero said at trial? It doesn't make any sense, folks. And, it's a small fact, but it ought to be one that everybody can agree on. If these were actual witnesses to the events of that day, whether or not his head was covered on the 7, 8, 9, 10-minute drive from the consulate to Lope de Vega, that should be something somebody would remember. All right, here's the last one I want to talk about. And this is getting into the weeds a lot. And we could actually spend a whole video talking just about this, and we may end up doing it later. But so I'm going to try and cover this briefly, and hopefully it'll make sense. I want to look at the map of the consulate and the Camelot again. Remember from the first video, I said there were two exits. Okay, there's the main exit, which is on Progreso Street. Okay, so that's to the west of the west side of the consulate building. Then there is a visa entrance exit area that had another exit that could be used. And that one is off of Libertad. So it's more on the south side of the building, directly across from the Libertad Cafe, if you're looking at the map. Okay. When the alleged witnesses talk about the abduction of Agent Camarena, there's a lot of discussion about which door he was going to come out of. And though it's not perfectly clear, many of those statements make it sound like Agent Camarena left through this other door, the south door, the visa door. And I've got a couple of pictures that will show you of what that looks like. Remember, it's really hard to take good pictures of the consulate. They're big, bad Mexican police who don't like you doing that. So they're not great pictures, but that's that south exit. Then they also make it sound as if, as Agent Camarena is walking across Libertad, before he's ever crossed Progreso, that's when they walk up to him and say, the famous words, the commandant wants to see you, and that leads to the kidnapping. Okay. Here's what doesn't make sense. Here's where this all doesn't add up. Number one, as I've said before, every single person you talk to, and I've sat and I've had discussions and I've had repeated discussions with people who were there, every single person says you left out of the main entrance on Progreso Street, not this southern entrance that went across Libertad. Every single person says that. In fact, when Agents Camarena and Kirkendall returned to the American consulate from the Camelot, a little bit before 2 o'clock or 1:30, whatever, they went across Libertad, across Progreso, and into the main entrance. How would it be? Why would it be that Agent Camarena would have come out of a different door at any time? And more importantly, how is it that anybody would have known that? Right? He's in a hurry. He's late for lunch. So how would anybody have ever known that? So that's number one. Number two, if he came across Libertad, more towards the Libertad Cafe, again on the map, he's nowhere near his truck. But we know that he got to his truck because the truck was unlocked. And If he's there, remember where everybody has placed the abduction vehicle, at least to start. It was someplace beyond where Agent Camarena's truck was. So it was down Libertad to the west from the Camelot. So that would have meant that Agent Camarena would have had plenty of time to see them coming if they stopped him while he was walking across Libertad. So what does that mean? It means nothing makes sense. It's a famous comedian with a routine about that. It just doesn't add up, though. Right? It just doesn't make sense. What conclusions can we start to draw? Number one, I think it is highly likely, and I'm hedging only for the sake of, academic honesty, of not saying we know for sure, but Rene Lopez Romero probably was never in the abduction vehicle, probably was never involved in the abduction himself. And everything being said is a made up, after the fact story. Story designed to keep him in the United States, story to make him appealing to the prosecution, to keep him valuable to Hector Boreas. And it's worked because he testified, he's been paid, and he lives in Las Vegas, Nevada. What else does all this tell you? It tells you that there was something else going on. Geez, Jack, that's pretty clear. Thanks for being so nebulous. If you look at the timeline, okay, I'll put it back up one more time. Here's the known timeline. Isn't it odd of how small a window there really was? How little time there really was for the abductors to be there while Agent Camarena was walking across the street by himself, unlike the last time he crossed the street when he was with another DEA agent. The last thing I'll say, and there are unquestionably people who will disagree with this. I think there are some people who might agree with it. I think if you look at all the facts, that it's likely, or even if you want to hedge, it's possible that Agent Camarena knew or recognized one or more of the abductors. And that's how they were able to get so close to him, irrespective of where he actually was. The events of February 7, February 8, 1985 were tragic. They had profound implications then, and they still do. I've told you before, I've had the distinct honor of speaking with Kiki Jr., Agent Camarena's son, who is a judge in San Diego. And I've heard him speak about the pain that he still feels of having grown up without a father. And the one thing I want to leave you with today is have a critical eye when people say they know what happened, especially when they have something to gain, something to profit as a result of saying they know what happened. All right, that's enough for today. This has been Cartels, Conspiracies, and Camarena. Thanks for listening.